So today in medicine, we start to reinvent what they already knew or what they already had found out in the late 19th century, that the colors have specific effects on our health. We can prove scientifically for many of the colors in the rainbow spectrum that they really have effects which can be objectively demonstrated.
Photobiology, the therapeutic use of light to improve health. Hi, this is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health, and today we are privileged to be joined by Dr. Alexander Wunsch from Germany, who is one of the leading experts in the entire world in photobiology, and I'm absolutely thrilled to engage in dialogue with him. And many people aren't aware of the historical significance of this topic with respect to how it's been used over the past few centuries. And that's what we're going to explore today so that you can develop a framework and a perspective. The last time I interviewed Dr. Wunsch was on the dangers of artificial LED lighting. And that interview has almost 1 million views at this point. So if you haven't seen it already, please look at that, because that's going to go into some practical real world aspects of photobiology. But this time, we're going to focus on the historical components so that it help you get a better appreciation of its potential. So welcome, and thank you for joining us today from Germany, Dr. Wunsch.
Hi, Dr. Mercola.
All right, so why don't you start off by sort of setting the frame for how light has been used therapeutically, probably not just centuries, but for thousands of years. I mean, we can go back to ancient Egypt, where there's maybe even start there, and then it could progress into the more recent therapeutic use of light.
Yeah, I think I could even go back a few 100,000 years, because what particularly makes us to the human beings we are is the use of fire. And since up to 2 million years ago, humans or our ancestors were using fire, and I'm pretty sure that they realized very soon that fire, that the heat which is emitted by the bonfire has also kind of therapeutic value. And we know, then we can make the step to the Egyptian times. But what I think it's important to highlight, that we had hundreds of thousands of years time in human evolution to fully adapt not only to sunlight, but also to the influence of fire, of near-infrared and mid-infrared radiation, which is emitted by all incandescent light sources, like we have it in the case of fire. And when we think about Egypt, then there was already a kind of lighting industry, because the Egyptians wouldn't have been able to build their pyramids and their large building structures without using artificial light inside these buildings. It's very often quoted that you have pictures of pharaohs which show the Ankh cross, which represents health in the Egyptian religion or in the Egyptian culture. But in fact, when you go into the details, we cannot really prove that there is light therapy existing in ancient Egypt. What we can say is that sunlight was used for hygienic purposes, this for sure, and just a few sources, they mention, for example, kind of photodynamic therapy. So it was a small part of light therapy, which can be proven in a scientific manner, and a very large part, a large portion of hygienical use of sunlight. But I think from the moment on when humans were able to manufacture glassworks, it was also possible to produce colored light using the glass, the colored glass, as a kind of filter technology.
Terrific. So it's interesting to realize that our ancient ancestors, perhaps for as long as millions of years, have been exposed to light at night, but it's been only from fire, essentially, and the wavelengths of that are really very, very low in blue, virtually almost non-existent, but they go up to certainly the higher wavelengths, to nanometers, to several thousand nanometers of, from 800 to several thousand. So, and of course in the visible spectrum, but I guess the point here is that our physiology, our retina, was never designed to be exposed to the blue wavelengths at night. I mean, you're just not going to see those. So, and that is exactly what our culture is not experiencing at this point, which we're going back to the old presentation, but it's just so important to understand this historical perspective, and that's one of the reasons why it's so crucial to block that blue light at night. And then, of course, also in the daytime if it's from artificial sources that are not incandescent bulbs like halogen or incandescents. So, well, let's progress now to the I think you wanted to start about the 18th century and how some of the more recent pioneers have started to use light therapeutically for illness.
Yeah, I call the time before 1800th century, I call the mystical phase of light use, because humans already felt and they had clear indications that light does them good, but they didn't explore it in a scientific manner. And in the 18th century, we call it also the age of enlightenment. People became much more interested in the reasons why the occurrences happen around them. So this fostered science massively. And there was a very important guy in Germany, Ehrenfried Walter von Tschirnhaus. He lived in the area of Dresden, and he was experimenting with large, huge lenses and with huge mirrors. And he concentrated sunlight with really huge devices. So he was, for example, able to ignite wood underwater more or less immediately by focusing solar energy through his optical apparatuses. And he was able to smelt metals, he was able to smelt glass, and this really boosted the scientific progress, because, for example, the Dresden glasswork, they were able to build very precise lenses. So the optical world was explored using the inventions of Ehrenfried Walter von Tschirnhaus. And in this realm, there was a guy, his name was Andreas Gärtner. He was known as the Saxonian Archimedes. And he, I think, in my awareness, he was the one who built the first phototherapeutical device. It was a foldable mirror made from plaster, and it was a hollow mirror covered with gold leaf. And using this he could concentrate sunlight onto aching joints of patients, for example. So people suffering from arthritis, from rheumatism, from gout, they found pain relief from this phototherapeutical unit. And later on nowadays, we can explain clearly how this really worked, because the gold leaf absorbed all the ultraviolet radiation from sunlight. Otherwise, he would have induced phototoxic reaction, kind of sunburn. If you focus the sunlight without filtering out the UV, you can imagine that this is not really a beneficial activity. But using this combination of materials, he was able to produce these so-called luminous heat rays, the near infrared and the red, which is so beneficial because it can penetrate deeply into the tissue. And so this, in a museum in Dresden, you still can watch, you can look at this first, I think, phototherapeutical appliance from the beginning of the 18th century.
I had kind of a question on that. You had mentioned that I didn't realize that gold leaf would actually absorb the UV, but I know it's really useful for reflecting all the infrared. In fact, they use it in some of the space telescopes for that very purpose, collect all that and focus it. So I don't think there's any element in the universe that reflects infrared more effectively than that. So would that be another potential reason, the lack of UV plus the focused infrared into the tissue?
Yeah, it's interesting that UV behaves quite peculiar in combination with certain metals. For example, silver only reflects about 4% of the incident UV radiation, and gold almost absorbs all the parts. And the best reflector for UV is the aluminum, if we talk about metals. So it's always, when we talk about phototherapy, besides the heliotherapeutic applications, we always have to look at the light source, and we have to look at the beam shaping media, such as the reflector or lenses, because they all contribute to the final blend of wavelengths, which then come into action in the phototherapeutical intervention.
Interesting. Okay, so why don't you walk us through the progression after the ones you just mentioned?
In the late 19th century, a lot of things happened in the realm of understanding how light acts upon the human body. It started with the experiments of just the name, Downs and Blunt. They found out that ultraviolet radiation would kill bacteria, but the researchers were also interested in other parts in the optical spectrum. For example, the General Augustus Pleasanton, he published a book in 1877 where he described his experiments he performed between 1861 and 1876. Starting with his grapery, he grew wine in his grapery, and he was using not only transparent, colorless glass, he also used blue window glass, and found out that he got a significant increase in the growth behavior in plants. And later on, he also applied this to humans. And from our today's viewpoint, it was kind of weird, because people in the late 19th century, especially in the United States, would walk around with blue glasses. So in a way, they did exactly the opposite of what we do today in order to protect our eyesight. They even enhanced the blue part in the spectrum, because they used it as a kind of booster, as a kind of doping, and didn't care about the long-term effects, which are pretty negative, as we know.
So if you're wearing blue glasses, then you would increase the blue exposure and you would limit the red and the infrared. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the problem with the blue is that it always, the problem is always if you overdose things. And for short-term use, increased blue light, blue enriched light can activate our cells, but we adapt pretty swiftly to this effect. So the effect, the stimulating effect, is wearing out after a short while. So walking around with blue colored glasses definitely is not a good idea. To use them for a few minutes, for example, this can be a good idea, and we know from today's scientific viewpoint that we need at least 1 hour, or especially our kids need at least 1 hour of unfiltered daylight during adolescence in order to prevent them from suffering from myopia. So it's always not pure blue and not pure blocking. Somewhere in between is the golden pathway to health. But of course, if we look around, we have problematic light sources. We talked about this in our last interview, and the problem is that in the course of evolution, it did not happen that it gets dark and that your body produces melatonin, and out of the sudden it can become bright as daylight with very high portions of blue. And the blue, especially during nighttime when the melatonin is up, has even more detrimental effect on our retina. But coming back to General Augustus Pleasanton in the late 19th century, he published his book in the same year when Dr. Seth Pencoast also published a book, but not only on blue light, but also on red light. So in a way, he already covered both ends of the spectrum and understood or used the antagonistic effects of red and blue light in order to stimulate sympathetic activity using the red and parasympathetic activity using the blue. And just 1 year later, in 1878, the year before Edison invented the incandescent lamp, Dr. Edwin Dwight Babbit published a book on the principles of light and color. And he was using the full set of rainbow colors which had been discovered by Newton, and later on he used the color set of Goethe. And this is really a remarkable book, I think 800 pages or so. It was first published in 1878 and a second edition in 1896. And if one has the time, it's really worthwhile taking a look into this epic work. So Edwin Dwight Babbit, he was a chromotherapist, as well as Seth Pencoast and General Augustus Pleasanton. So today in medicine, we start to reinvent what they already knew or what they already had found out in the late 19th century, that the colors have specific effects on our health state, on our organism. So using the correct colors means you can communicate with all your different organs in your system. So it is sometimes kind of esoteric discipline, people think, but in the meantime we can prove scientifically for many of the colors in the rainbow spectrum that they really have effects which can be objectively demonstrated.
Can you highlight some of the primary observations that Dr. Babbit had come up with in the late 19th century that have been forgotten or just being rediscovered at this point? Some of the primary ones.
Oh, the Babbit book covers all and everything, and from that perspective, it's not so easy to highlight a single aspect. But what comes into my mind is the model of the atom. It is a sketch or kind of a graphical representation of how he thought that the atom is consisted of. So the structure, it's like a kind of vortex system, very complicated. It resembles the outer shape of a human heart in a way, and it is based on a vortex system, which leads to the fact that for a certain time the particles are visible to the outside or detectable to the outside, and in the other phase it's kind of turned inside. And this reminds me to some findings in quantum physics and some findings in the 20th century physics, that we come in a way to this kind of concept that we talk about oscillations, we talk about vacuum. So it's matter is made of almost 100% space and frequency and oscillation, and this is what Babbit already presented in his very specific way. Okay. But coming back to the, for example, to the use of colored light, he had a kind of bottle which was shaped as a lens. He could put in some salt solutions in order to produce colors in a reproducible way, because the best way to produce a color filter which gives you always the same color is to use solutions of salt, of colored salt. It's much more precise than using, for example, gel filters or glass filters. And so he had this kind of lens-shaped bottle. He was able to focus colored light onto certain parts of the body. He also had a very beautiful glass window which had different sections in many different colors, and you would just lay down behind this window, and if the sun would shine in, the colors were automatically projected to different parts of your organism.
Was he able to achieve any remarkable clinical therapeutic benefits for the use of these applications that were surprising at the time and maybe still likely be today?
Be it Pleasanton or Penn Coast or Babbit, they all had results, with therapeutic results using these colors. The problem was that it's very difficult to reproduce these effects, starting with the problem that the sun doesn't always shine. And they were pioneers in chromotherapy in a time where electrical lighting was not available. So people, in a way, had a better circadian rhythmicity without electrical lighting, but in terms of scientific precision with regard to producing colored light, they had worse conditions than we have it today. Today we can exactly produce the same colors anytime during the day and during the year. But there was one guy, his name is Dinsha Gadyali. He came from India and lived the second half of his life in the United States. And in 1897, he rescued the life of a patient using the instructions of Babbit. And it was colitis. It was an inflammatory disease in the intestines. Mm-hmm. And Dinsha used the Babbit principle he knew from reading the principles of light and color, that indigo colored light would be able to stop vomiting and to stop to break this process of disease in this patient, female patient, young female. And this started a new chapter in chromotherapy, but Dinsha had to experiment and investigate for more than 23 years after that before he was able to present his system to the public. But in the meantime, a lot of other important things happened, because the late 19th century was the century where Niels Ryberg Finsen from Denmark started his research in the effects of colors, and he was the first to make a discrimination between the negative phototherapy and a positive phototherapy. And sometimes in some textbooks you would read that Finsen was that he kind of coined the scientific chromotherapy because he was using red light in order to treat patients suffering from smallpox. But in fact, this was not really the red light he was using. He shielded out, or he removed the short wavelength part of the spectrum, especially the ultraviolet and the violet, indigo and blue. And the colors which remain, they are located in the longer wavelength part in the spectrum. And you can be 100% sure if you paint a room completely in red and you are using red curtains and red tissue or cloth, that you would have 100% elimination of blue, and the short wavelength part, the blue, the indigo, was the reason for the inflammatory reaction in patients with smallpox. So Finsen not invented, but he reinvented the negative phototherapy, which means you eliminate certain parts of the spectrum which would exaggerate the development of a disease. And this happened in the beginning of in the early 1890s. And from this observation that the short wavelengths in the spectrum would amplify the inflammatory reaction in smallpox, this observation led him to the idea that light acts as an incitement. So it is able to produce the inflammatory reaction. In smallpox, this would be a problem, but he was thinking about the treatment of tuberculosis. And treating tuberculosis, his idea was if he could produce the inflammation in the tissue, then the body would be able to cure itself, to cure himself. And this is what he finally developed, a positive phototherapy, which means he produced exactly this part in the spectrum he formerly wanted to exclude, and using the short wavelength parts enabled him to very successfully treat tuberculosis, especially in the skin. And he was able to establish a light institute in Copenhagen, because the problem was that the sunlight, which was the most potent UV light source, was not available for more than 30 days in a year in Copenhagen. And so his idea was to use electrical light. And in the late years of the 1890s, he established his Finsen Institute in Copenhagen and successfully treated patients with tuberculosis from all over the world. And finally, he was awarded with the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1903. So this was one of the most important persons in the end of the 19th, in the beginning of the 20th century. And Finsen's work fueled the progress of phototherapy for the next 30, 40, or 50 years. So from 1900 to 1950, the phototherapy was a kind of state-of-the-art therapeutic intervention in medicine. So people would not say, oh, it's only light. They would say, oh, it's light therapy. We can cure you just using the light rays.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Let me just diverge on a bit of a tangential but important question with Finsen's work, because let me reemphasize that he was able to effectively treat tuberculosis, which really had no treatment prior to that. This was 40, 50 years before the advent of pharmacological medication, which is currently used today. And tuberculosis is a very slow-growing organism and very hard to treat, and it's usually given multiple drugs to treat it. But 50 years before that, he was getting results, and this is because it's germicidal. The UV light is germicidal. This is one of the reasons why it's useful to hang your clothes on a light outside, exposing it to sunshine, because it kills not only the bacteria but all the loads of other microbes and viruses that might contaminate your bed materials and your clothing. But I'm wondering, in tropical or subtropical environments, tuberculosis is still a problem. But probably my guess is their nutrition isn't up to speed, so their immune system's suppressed. But obviously in those environments they have access to massive amounts of ultraviolet exposure year-round near the equatorial regions. So what is your speculation as a physician why with exposure to the light, where Finsen was able to treat patients with tuberculosis, people still come down with tuberculosis in those areas if they're exposed to the light.
I think the first, what the Western missionaries, is it a word which exists, from the church, those who traveled the world to
missionaries,
bring
right.
missionaries. The first, what they told the indigenous population, that it's a sin to walk around naked. Yeah, you're laughing, but this is kind of major influence. If you ask people to dress themselves in the manner like we do, and they are used to be exposed to the sun in their culture. I don't think that nowadays in the third world or developing part of the world that we have this kind of social behavior these cultures had before the Western world was intruding these parts of the globe. And the poverty, the overpopulation, the use of clothes, all these habits, they changed in a way that they don't really benefit from the ultraviolet radiation anymore.
Okay, well, that's perfect. I never would have guessed. It was not in my consciousness to realize that the introduction of these missionaries that taught them to put clothes on was essentially abolishing the beneficial exposure to the ultraviolet radiation, but it makes perfect sense. And it really is a powerful illustration of what we do in our own culture, even in the sun-time, when we have similar access to beneficial radiation. Very few of us are outside with minimal clothing. When we go outside, we typically are clothed from really the bottom of our neck to our feet. And you're not going to get a lot of useful radiation through the exposure on your face. And in fact, that's probably the last place you want to have it, because the skin on your face is so thin, it's going to accelerate photoaging, and the surface area is so small. The major benefit is on your chest, back, legs, and arms. And if you're hiding them under clothes, it's not going to penetrate. That UV, those short wavelengths have very limited penetration capability. The longer the wavelength, the deeper it penetrates. And I mean, they only go a few millimeters on bare skin, and they're certainly not going to go through clothes.
Yeah, so this is the problem we have today. It's not that the sun wouldn't shine, but we stay out of the sunlight when it's efficient, when it's mostly efficient. On one hand, we cover our skin with clothes, and we don't have the time to go out for 30 minutes during noontime. Many of us have to stay at the workplace and are not allowed to take a break for, let's say, half an hour or 20 minutes. And yeah, we took our behavioral pattern and tried we brought it to other societies, to other cultures who in a way had an inborn instinct or their own way of living in order to deal with the sun in a beneficial way.
Yeah. So one of the craziest mistakes that most of us make is to repeat the errors of our ancestors, or to have to make the same mistakes twice. So to me, this is one of the most important points that we're making here in this whole dialogue, is the appreciation that lack of exposure to the sunlight can have some really serious adverse consequences on your health, as illustrated by the fact that these third world countries, because they're putting clothes on, don't have access to the ultraviolet radiation, and they're coming down with tuberculosis. So why make the same mistake? We need to learn from that and incorporate that. And we're going to have many more discussions on this, not just this interview. I plan on interviewing many more times because you're one of, my passion is photobiology. You're one of the leading experts in the world on this, and I'm looking to learn so much more from you. As you just shared with me now, I didn't understand this principle. But to teach people this and to apply that so that we can just access these essentially free resources and optimize our own biology that was designed to heal with this exposure. And this lack of exposure to this vital therapeutic biological radiation, which has profound molecular biological consequences, which we can go into detail in future presentations. I mean, in minute pathways that get optimized when you accept this exposure is just profound. And to obtain those benefits is so simple. Just get access to the sun as much as you can at the right times. Now, in the winter, it's at solar noon, and in the middle of the summer in a subtropical area, it's probably 7, 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. You don't want to stay out of the noon because it's too much. It's the Goldilocks dose. You just want to get enough. You don't want to get too much. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, this brings me, I don't want to, do we have still some time?
Oh yes, absolutely, yes we do.
Because I don't want to leave the 19th century.
Oh, no, continue on. I'm sorry for an interruption, but I like to.
It fits perfectly together.
Okay.
Because there was a very, very important man from the United States who invented a phototherapeutical method in the late 19th century, and this was John Harvey Kellogg. You might have heard of him.
Sure. Sanatorium in Battle Creek, Michigan.
Battle Creek Sanitarium.
Yeah.
And he was starting to perform the heliotherapy. He treated his patient first in 1876. This was about the time when John Harvey Kellogg started using sunlight as a therapeutic measure. And shortly after the invention of the incandescent lamp, he filed a patent for an incandescent light bath, and this was in 1891. And in the following 2 years, he treated thousands of patients with this incandescent light bath, and he exhibited this system at the World Exhibition in Chicago in 1893. And there was a visitor from Germany, from Berlin, a chemist, Dr. Willibald Gebhardt, and he was so fascinated by this incandescent light bath. So it didn't use the UV, it exactly used the opposite, the red and the near-infrared heat rays, the luminous heat rays. And Gebhardt went back to, he visited Kellogg at the Battle Creek Sanitarium and learned all about the use of this incandescent light bath. And then he took this technology and the knowledge back to Berlin, where he started to produce these light baths extensively. And during the next few years, he was able to establish hundreds of light institutes throughout Germany in all major cities. They had several of these light institutes where people were using incandescent light in order to treat themselves when they suffered from pain, from gout, from rheumatism, from psoriasis. So this was even a threat for the physicians, because they couldn't help their patients better than they could help themselves when they visited and treated themselves in these light institutes. And it took a few years. In the beginning of the 20th century, someone from the United States discovered this incandescent light bath technology in Germany and brought it back to the United States, where it initially came from. And so Kellogg, he wrote a book, a textbook, which has the title Light Therapeutics, and the first edition was published in 1910, and the second edition, I think, in 1926 or so. And you can get this as a PDF, and I really would recommend this to everyone who is interested in phototherapy, because this is the basic knowledge, everything you have to know about sunlight, about ultraviolet light, about visible light, about the near infrared, about the use of cold, the use of heat. It's all contained in this book from John Harvey Kellogg.
Wow.
And it's still, in my understanding, this is the first book to read if you want to understand better how light in the different parts of the spectrum interacts with the organism. And it's very systematically structured, and in my understanding it's still up to date, because you can really learn a lot from, for example, everyone warns you about sunburn, but in the pre-antibiotic era, the medical doctors sometimes had to completely change the direction in a patient. So if the health was constantly going down, they had to make a mark to change the direction of this downward development. And here sunlight was one of the therapeutical options. And I would not recommend to use this today, but Kellogg, for example, he describes in detail the 4 different stages of a sunburn. And the first thing is that he says a sunburn is not a burn injury. A burn injury appears immediately, and a sunburn appears with a delay time of several hours. So he didn't know anything about reactive oxygen species these days, but he exactly explained that there is definitely a huge difference between an immediate heat-induced burn and a kind of phototoxic reaction as you find it in a sunburn. And he discriminated, or he describes 4 different stages of a sunburn, from 1 to 4, with 4 is with blisters and 1 is just the mild erythema. And he, in these days, without antibiotics, sometimes in some patients deliberately chose to induce a second degree or third degree erythema in order to change the direction of the development of the
Perfect.
of the health of a certain patient. So you can learn a lot about from these explanations, even if you would not reproduce anything he is describing, but it gives you the best insight in phototherapy for a layman. You can understand it as a layman, and you can understand it as a physician. It covers. It's written in a way that he reaches all the different people with their different horizons. So
Sure.
yeah, light therapeutics.
All right, thank you for that, Pearl. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. My guess is, since it was written in 1926 and previously, that it predates the copyright laws. So it's available free. So all you have to do is
really
look up
available. Yes.
Light Therapeutics by John Harvey Kellogg, online, PDF, and then you got it and download. I am going to read that book before our next interview, I assure you. One specific question, though. I'm assuming that the heliotherapy that he instituted, because it was from an incandescent bulb, was very low in blue and primarily red and near infrared, that provided the most of the benefit. Would that be a fair assumption?
He was using the phototherapy with sunlight.
Oh, that's right.
He used the arc light, the carbon arc light. He used the incandescent light bath, and he was using the quartz light as well. In the early 20th century, Richard Küch, he was a physicist from Germany. He invented the quartz lamp. It's a gas mercury discharge lamp with a quartz tube, and quartz glass is transparent for ultraviolet radiation. And before this invention of the quartz lamp, the artificial light with the highest output in UV was the carbon arc lamp. And depending on the composition of the carbon, physicists tried to increase the UV output, but you had the problem that you have massive heat in the carbon arc lamp, and that you have smoke and dirty air and consumption of oxygen. So for the actinic therapy, which is the use of ultraviolet radiation, the quartz light was really a quantum leap. It was a step in a new kind of therapeutical option. And he used everything which was available. Kellogg just covers in his book all the different light sources and how to use them. Okay. And by the way, not only this book is available as a PDF without copyright. You can get all the books I was talking about, Pleasanton's book, Seth Pencoast's book, and even Babbitt's book in a perfect quality. It's high quality, digitized, and available as PDF.
Perfect. We'll seek to provide links to those for anyone who's interested. And do you think there's benefit? So your recommendation would be to read Kellogg's book first, and there would be additional value to read the other books too?
The other books are very, if you're interested in the history of spirituality and esoterics, then you can read also the other books. And if you have a lot of time, and if you have an open mind to look into a lot of different facets of the emanation of life, I would say Babbit is highly recommendable as well. But in order to learn about phototherapy and in terms of having an introduction which is concise and comprehensive, it's Light Therapeutics from Kellogg.
Okay.
From Kellogg. If you refer to a contemporary textbook in phototherapy, you will not learn what you can learn from Light Therapeutics.
Well, that's great news, and thank you for those pearls of wisdom and free resources. Who doesn't like free resources? So that's great. You don't even have to buy a book. You get it for free, and ideally, and I think we're both in agreement on this, I'm going to read these on my Kindle, and the Kindle is probably the best device to use, especially it has an LED backlight, but you can turn it off, and if you're in the sunlight, you're reading essentially with reflected sunlight. So it's almost as good as reading a paperback book or a hardcover book, a printed book is what I meant to say, printed book.
It could even be better because if you read a paperback book, you have these whiteners, which transform a lot of UV light into visible short wavelength light.
Oh,
so
okay.
the whiter a paper is, the worse it's for your eyes, for your retina.
So the Kindle with the backlight off is be better than a printed book. Interesting.
Yeah.
And it's certainly more convenient. And for those who don't know, these PDFs, and I'll see to include some instructions in here that you download, you can go to your Kindle account and go to your Kindle devices and then identify the email address of that device and then send that address a copy of the PDF, and it will appear magically on your Kindle. So, and there's no charge for it. You can get these free on your Kindle. And that's the simple trick. A lot of people don't know that that's the way that you do that.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
But I have to warn you, for example, Seth Pencoast is a file of 250 MB. So it's...
no, then it won't work. Then it won't work unless you convert it to, because there's a limit, because you have to be able to email, so it has to be under 10 megabytes or more. So then you wouldn't be able to convert it to your Kindle.
Maybe it's possible to convert it to downside.
Yeah, what you might want to do is copy it physically into a Word document and then take the Word document and send that file to your Kindle. Yeah, that might work. Or get rid of the pictures. All right, well, I'm sorry to interrupt the flow, but let's go on to the next person, which I believe is Dr. Bernard, who's a Swiss surgeon.
This was all happening in the realm of Finsen's work. In the late 19th century, light really was prevalent. It was sunlight that if people would move from the country to the cities, they would have a higher prevalence for rickets, for example, and tuberculosis. And it became clearer and clearer in the 19th century that sunlight has to do something with it. And in the Swiss mountains, near Davos, a surgeon, Dr. Oskar Bernhardt, he was using sunlight even before Finsen was inaugurating his method. For example, when as a surgeon he had to operate on patients with pulmonary tuberculosis, and for example with tuberculosis in the joints, and Oskar Bernhardt, for example, he found out that if he used the sunlight during the surgery, so before the wound closure, he would put out the patient for 10 or 15 minutes into direct sunlight. And what he found that this improved the healing significantly. So even in surgical cases, the sunlight was applied by Oskar Bernhard, and in the Swiss mountains, we know that we have increased, elevated concentration of ultraviolet radiation in the heights of the mountains. And there was another, the sun doctor. He entered the stage a bit later than Oskar Bernhard. Oskar Bernhard was a pioneer in the 1880s and 1890s. So even before Finsen was developing his method, Bernhard already used the sunlight in his medical practice, in his surgical practice. Another Swiss guy, the sun doctor, Auguste Rollier, he started in 1905 treating patients in Lessin in Switzerland, or again in the mountains. And he ran, I think, up to 40 different hospitals in this area in the 1930s, 1940s. And he was the one with more than 50 years of experience with the heliotherapy. Rollier only used heliotherapy. He was convinced that artificial light cannot do the job and that sunlight is superior. And so Rollier was the master of heliotherapy in these days. Up to the 1950s, in the mid of the 1950s, he passed away, and he was treating his patients, I think, more than 50 years from the beginning to the mid of the 20th century.
Did he compile any of his findings into a book like Kellogg did?
I don't know if there is an English version of his paramount book, but of course he wrote a lot of he published a lot of books on his method. But I have some, I think, even freely available reviews on the work of Rollier. I will check it up and I will provide the PDF.
Okay, perfect.
If it's no problem with the copyright.
We would love it. Yes.
Because Rollier, he was really the master of heliotherapy. He not only used the sunlight, he had a kind of coherent healing system which integrated the psychological aspects. He was a holistic physician, a holistic healer, who not only used sunlight in a very skillful manner, but also all the other options, using music and kind of physiotherapy, the work therapy. He invented a lot of different appliances which enabled the patients to lay in their beds and do some work and be productive, and not only a lazy piece of flesh which is taking the space in the hospital room. And this was very important for people suffering from tuberculosis being treated in Switzerland, because it was quite expensive to stay there as a patient, and the relatives, they had problems to send their patients to to the Swiss mountains and to pay a lot of money. And so Bollier even gave them the chance to to make some money during their stay in the hospitals. So it was really a holistic system, which is, I think, well described, of course, in his books. And I have at least one article, one paper, which describes it in a very understandable manner, how he treated all the different aspects of his patients very successfully. And he had very, very good results, much better compared to what we expect from tuberculosis treatment using the stage 5-phase antibiotics treatment we have nowadays.
Yeah, and we know that ultraviolet radiation is directly germicidal to many microbes, but in addition, ultraviolet B exposure specifically helps the body produce vitamin D. And I didn't realize this until recently, but I guess that was discovered by a German, vitamin D synthesis, Adolf Windaus.
Adolf Windaus.
Yeah.
Yes, he discovered the molecule, and he also discovered how to synthesize it, how to produce it, and he received the Nobel Prize as well. Yeah.
Excellent.
And from that moment on, it became industrialized. For example, in Germany, we had where they produce milk, for example. They had irradiation systems for the milk. They had yeast irradiation with ultraviolet light in order to increase the content of vitamin D, also in the nutritional basics.
Yeah, and I think today
dairy products and so
the most common form of vitamin D, or D3 specifically, because when you irradiate animal material, you make vitamin D3. When you irradiate plant material like mushrooms, you make vitamin D2.
Yeah.
But the most common form of synthetic vitamin D3 is the irradiation of sheep lanolin. And that's where most of the vitamin D comes from. It's very inexpensive. It's one of the most inexpensive supplements out there. But the key here is that, and I think you and I are in complete agreement on this fact, is that vitamin D has many therapeutic benefits, no question. And if you can't have exposure to the sun, probably should take it. But it is actually a marker, a biological marker for ultraviolet B radiation exposure. So when your body has enough, your vitamin D level goes up. And it's more than just vitamin D. And it's naive to believe that you're going to get the same benefits as you would from artificially raising your vitamin D exposure to getting it raised normally the way it's designed to over hundreds of generations by the only way you can get it essentially was by exposure to the sun. Yes, there's these minute ways that you can, like eating polar bear liver and things like that, but for the most part, you're not designed to get vitamin D by swallowing it from animal material. You're designed to get it by exposure to the sun. So maybe you can just comment on that, because I think it's another practical take home from this. People, and I'm not saying you should not swallow vitamin D. You should if you know, but that's not the goal. The goal is not to get your vitamin D level up to this level by swallowing a pill. It's to get it up by exposing it to either the sun or some effective alternative that produces ultraviolet B exposure. And ideally, similar to the sun, so you get it balanced with the infrared, because we know just UV exposure by itself is not necessarily healthy. It can be problematic. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, the problem is if you have different input channels and you only serve one of these channels, then you get a kind of disorder and a kind of incoherency. And this is exactly what can happen if you administer vitamin D orally. It signals your system that you have lots of UV around you. And this might even start processes which are not adequate because your skin didn't have the exposure. So it's I think the best idea if you are if you have the skin type, so that you can stand the sun exposure, that you use this natural pathway, because then you have coordinated, coherent action pathways, which are not granted if you only serve one of the channels. And another aspect, of course, that it is still unclear if the vitamin D, the orally administered vitamin D, really reaches the skin layers where you normally need it as well, in the keratinocyte layer, for example. And cathelicidin is a substance which is produced under the influence of vitamin D in the skin, which helps the organism to fight germs, for example. And this might be one of the reasons why the heliotherapy and the UV therapy was so efficient with regard to tuberculosis treatment.
Okay. So, I think we've sort of reached the amount of time that we've committed to doing this specific interview. So I think I'd just like to stop here and then have you on again to continue with this in other areas. Really, you are, as I mentioned earlier, the main expert in this area in the world. I'm absolutely convinced of that, and I'm really excited that you're willing to meet with us on a regular basis to help us understand and apply this phenomenally valuable, essentially free input into practical applications. And you've done the homework, you've been studying this for decades, you understand it better than almost anyone on the planet, so I greatly appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us, because it has so many benefits. And having this historical grounding that you gave us and providing these pearls, free resources that we can read and get the grounding so that we can apply some other benefits. Because I've been convinced for decades myself, although I've never had the opportunity to study it like you have, that this is key to health. There's no question in my mind. It's almost as important as eating and exercise. And if you want to be optimally healthy, it is vital. There's no, in the truest sense of the word, vital to your optimal health. And virtually no one is teaching this. They did teach it in the past. We're seeking to rediscover what they were teaching 100 years ago. And it's just because of this manipulated bias that we have from this pharmacological corporate structure, which essentially directs almost all of the research. If it was authentically and sincerely motivated on specific healing principles, we would have expanded on the research you just described, and we haven't, because it's been artificially suppressed. So it's a sad reality, but the good news is that this is the 21st century. We only got to the beginning of the 20th, so we've got a lot more to talk about. But this is the 21st century. We have access to these powerful methods of communication where we can share this information, create a groundswell, people can start to understand this, and catalyze research and therapeutic interventions based on this solid information, which could improve their health and the health of the people that they love, and avoiding these toxic, expensive, and dangerous interventions that are commonly recommended for diseases that just don't need them. They respond perfectly well and ideally to normal interventions. It's just simple as you mentioned, that myopia. I mean, even yourself, you are wearing glasses. And if we had been optimally exposed and our parents had understood the information that we're trying to share, we would not have this problem. We would not have it.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. So again, much thanks and gratitude for sharing your wisdom, and I look forward to our future interviews.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Mercola.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.